Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nichols Schroeder. S.P. Miskowski is a recipient of 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, for literature and for drama. Her books have been recognized with 4 Shirley Jackson Award nominations and 2 Bram Stoker Award nominations. Her stories have appeared in many anthologies, including Haunted Nights, Human Monsters, Looming Low 1 and 2, The Madness of Dr. Caligari, Uncertainties 3, October Dreams 2, The Best Horror of the Year Volume 10, and Darker Companions, 50 Years of Ramsey Campbell, and in magazines including Identity Theory, Black Static, Vastarian, Supernatural Tales, and Cosmic Horror Monthly. Her grunge noir novel, I Wish I Was Like You, was named This Is Horror Novel of the Year 2017, and is available via Audible. An omnibus of her books set in the weird fictional town of Scaloot, Washington, is forthcoming from Broken Eye Books in 2025.
I listened to some of your interview with Lisa Tuttle. It was fascinating. It's really great that you're doing this. A lot of times we get into all sorts of discussions about writing online, but we don't talk about craft. We don't talk about it nearly enough. And I think that that's almost the whole thing, you know? I mean, you can talk about how to get your work out there and, publishing and all of that, and the political aspects of it and the social aspects of it and everything. But really, the interesting part to me is craft. So I'm happy that you guys are doing this. That's great.
Well, thank you. And we're really happy to have you on. We're very, very excited to have on S.P. Miskowski today, who I have been an admirer of for many years. And S.P. has also just been an extremely generous person to me, was one of my first champions in the writing world, one of the first people to kind of be a supporter in the community. So I'm just very grateful to you in general, SP, and really excited to finally be able to talk to you voice to voice. We've exchanged a lot of messages over the year, but it's the first time we've spoken verbally, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's very sweet. But it was obvious that you were extremely talented and were going to get a lot of work published and, do your own thing. So I was just happy to be one of your early readers.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me.
All right, first question, SP. What were some of the books that first got you excited about reading or writing? What were some of your first literary loves, so to speak?
I started reading very, very young, very early. I know that I was reading very well. I was reading proficiently when I started school. And that's because I have a sister who is about 16 years older than I am. And so when I was about 3, she was staying with our family, with her children, and her husband was in the service. So he was away and she came to live with us, and she had all of the usual stresses and worries of, a young married person with children. And it was interesting and fun for her to teach her son and myself how to read. So she started teaching us to read. We would just read anything, absolutely anything. So I remember reading at a very, very early age. It was something that I considered fun, and I didn't see it as a lesson. I didn't see it as work, so it stayed with me. When I went to school, I can remember just being crazy about the school library once I realized that we had a library on the premises. And I read some biographies. I read a biography of Beatrix Potter. I read a biography of Amelia Earhart and one about Annie Oakley. And so even at that age, in first grade, I was very taken with women who did interesting things. So I did that kind of reading. By the time I was about 8, I know I was reading Edgar Allan Poe. And I got into that because at the public library, how do I describe this? Edgar Allan Poe wasn't considered a horror writer. He was okay. His work was considered literature. So you would find him among all of the classics. And so I just picked it up and started reading his stories really early. And I think my first stories were sort of based on that reading. I was very taken with the intensity of them. And I started writing stories that were based on that reading. So I would say one of the early influences was definitely Edgar Allan Poe.
I can see the through line, actually. One of my favorite works of yours is your 2017 short story collection, Strange is the Night. Does your approach to short story writing look much different from your approach to novel writing? Do you outline your work in either case? Does it vary?
It's very different writing a short story for me, it's very different writing a short story and writing a novel. I didn't even attempt to write a novel when I started trying to get work published. In my early 20s, I was sending out short stories to literary magazines. There were just lots and lots of small press literary magazines. And I had classmates who would only aim at the top tier. They only were interested in getting published in the Paris Review, and they were working toward that. But I thought I wanted my work to be out there in the world, connecting with as many people as possible. And in the case of these little tiny magazines, sometimes that was a readership of a couple hundred people. It might not be a huge readership, but it was that connection that I liked, knowing that someone was actually reading this. I never expected to write a novel. I only ever expected to write short stories. And I wrote only short stories for years and years. And then I took a little detour into theater, a little 12-year detour, and wrote plays for a while when I lived in Seattle. I studied theater, I wrote plays, and then I came back around to writing short stories. And the first novel, Knock Knock, came about just, I don't know how it happened. It was accidental. My husband and I were staying with his grandmother in the country. I had insomnia. I don't usually have insomnia, but that night I couldn't sleep. And I was remembering all the stories that his grandmother, Carol Lee, had told me. And I got out one of my notebooks and I thought, well, okay, I'll kill some time and I'll put myself to sleep. And I started making notes, and it just went on and on and on. And everything I came up with led to something else. And I realized this is not a story. This is not a short story. This is bigger and more complicated. And so what I'm coming back around to finally, I'm sorry, such digression. I will outline and outline, take a lot of notes. It might take months, it might take a couple of years, but I will gather all of this material and keep outlining and revising an outline with a novel. With a short story, I just like to plunge into it. I just like to start. There's something, an image or an idea or a line, and I just start with that and see where it goes. And that's the joy for me of writing the short story, is that you just don't know what's out there. I don't know what's going to happen. And I like to think that each of the stories in Strange is the Night has its own world. I didn't make an attempt to make them all fit together or make them have the same aesthetic, or I wasn't attempting to do anything like that. So some people really like a cohesive collection. They like for everything to fit together, and I appreciate that. I do. That's beautiful when you do that. But in the case of Strange is the Night, it was really just every single story was its own adventure, its own world altogether. So that's the excitement for me in writing short fiction. But with a novel, yes, I will outline and then revise as I go. I'll probably end up with about, I don't know, 12, 15 outlines over the course of writing a novel, because it just keeps, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, what's going to occur to you. And so I scribble a lot of things. I keep notebooks full of material that I want to weave into the novel. I don't think I could build an entire novel without taking a lot of notes and starting with an outline and sort of shaping it. I'm aware of shaping it from the very beginning, whereas with short fiction, I'm really just finding out what's there. I don't even know what I think. I don't even know what the story's about. I just want to find out.
You mentioned having studied theater and shaping narratives. So I'm curious because I took one playwriting course and I'm aware that, there's like the 5-act structure as opposed to the 3-act, although you can do 1 act too. Could you speak a little more to kind of your involvement in theater, what drew you to it, and how that process maybe prepared you or fed into how you write short fiction, or I guess probably more novel-length fiction than short fiction, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, my very first involvement in theater, my first interest in it, was in high school. I was in a very kind of strict academic structured program when I was in middle school and first year of high school. And then my family moved across the country. We moved out west, and the requirements changed. And some of the things that I had been taking weren't available, but some of the classes were. And I didn't even realize that I didn't have to take all of these advanced classes. I knew that I had to take them at my old school. And so I signed up for all of these classes, and so I'm taking biology and geometry, and I'm taking all of these courses where I have to really concentrate. I'm taking American history, and I thought, oh God, this is just, I was at a new school. I didn't know anybody, and I had this really tough program set for myself, but no one to talk to about it. My mentor from high school was gone. I was in the bookstore looking up the textbooks that I was going to need, and I saw this one that looked very interesting, and I picked it up and started leafing through it, and it was a theater text. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. It looks like these people are having a great time. And I just decided to switch out one of my courses, one of my electives, for a theater class, because I just felt like I needed to, at some point during the day, get up and move around and talk to people and get to know some more people. I just needed something that was more active, because I had this tough academic program I'd set for myself. So I signed up for a theater class, and I took theater for, I took it for 3 years. And I wasn't really good at it. I mean, I was good enough to play a couple of comic roles. What I really enjoyed was working backstage, working on props and things. So I had that experience in high school. It was mostly positive, and so I kind of carried that with me. And I went to college, I continued writing short stories through college. And then years later, when I came up to Washington, when I moved up to Seattle, my circumstances were such that, again, I didn't know anybody, and I needed a network of people, and I needed something to connect me to people. And so I went to UW and I signed up for a playwriting class, because it was the one thing that was available that seemed to me that I could probably jump right into. And the head of the program encouraged me to sign up for the playwriting program, the graduate program, instead of just taking one class. So I took a couple of courses and I did that. I signed up for the graduate program in playwriting. And it was fascinating, but it wasn't satisfying. I had been to London a couple of times. I had been to theater in Seattle. I had been to theater in a couple of different cities. And I knew what I liked. I knew what was exciting. I knew it was thrilling to watch. And I didn't feel that I was getting to that place as a writer, as a playwright, okay? I felt like I was learning how to craft a well-constructed 3-act play. And okay, that's good to know. I mean, anything you learn about your craft is going to serve you at some point, right? But after I graduated, and I had some work produced in Seattle, several of the theaters there commissioned me. I got an NEA fellowship in drama. Things were going well. Things went really well for me in Seattle, but I felt that I was not, it wasn't even a matter of living up to my potential. It's just I wasn't doing the thing that made me feel really alive as a writer. Okay. So I was writing these plays, and it was really hard to quit because I had achieved the thing that I set out to do, which was to connect with other people. And oh boy, I loved the people I worked with in theater. They were amazing. There were so many talented people. And I hated to move away from it. I hated to give it up. In fact, I wrote a couple of plays after I moved away from Seattle, and I went back there to help develop those. But that was it. I after that, I said, I'm still not satisfied with what I'm writing. I felt like the actors were making the work better, and I felt like I couldn't get to the point where I felt like, yeah. So I started writing fiction again, and I wrote a few short stories, and I said, boy, I feel wobbly at this now. I don't know if I can do this again. And it took a little while, but I started to feel more and more excited by that. I think studying theater was a good thing for me. I think it was healthy, and I think it allowed me to sort of stretch and grow as a writer. But I'm not really a theater person, and I didn't feel that that was where I belonged or where I wanted to keep on working. So I came back around to writing short stories. And then the next thing was, okay, will anybody publish these? So I started, tentatively, carefully sending stories out a little at a time, just testing the water. And Identity Theory picked up one of my stories. And I thought, well, that's okay. This feels really good. This feels like me. And because I started writing so young, I do think that there's something in me. I don't know if it's psychological or neurological or what it is, but I have to write. I need to write. And I get from writing short stories and writing novels that feeling, that during the process, that being alive feeling that I didn't ever get from playwriting. While I was writing the plays, I was very conscious of the fact that someone would have to say these lines. I was very conscious of the fact that if I wanted a boat on stage, I had worked backstage. I knew how many people were going to have to drag that boat onto the stage. And so I was thinking all of these things instead of thinking purely about the writing itself and what it could do. So when I finally came back around to it and I made up my mind to stick with this, I was much happier. And that's not because of the people I worked with or any of the opportunities I had in Seattle. I'm very grateful to all the people who took a chance on me and worked with me. But I personally didn't get that feeling of, yes, I'm writing, that I get from short stories and novels. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It does. You touched on a lot of interesting things there. I mean, one of them was this idea of constraints endemic to writing for theater. If you're writing fiction, prose fiction, there are none of those constraints in terms of budget or pragmatic. So there is something, I guess, liberating about writing prose fiction as opposed to theater. And as you were talking about pedagogy, I was also thinking about your novel, I Wish I Was Like You, which features a washed up crime writer and instructor who he has these fantastic dogmatic writing rules that pop up throughout the book. Right. And your book flouts those rules sometimes in thoughtful ways. You remix elements of mystery and ghost story plots. So something I wanted to ask you, SP, is if you have a set of quote unquote writing rules you try to adhere to, or do you reject this idea of writing rules altogether?
My only writing rule is It's not a rule. It's a guideline. It's a suggestion. This is one of the things you can do. You can do it, or you can twist it, or you can make it into something else, but it's not a rule. You don't have to do it. I've read widely enough in college and in graduate school to know that the range in terms of style and content and subject and approach is vast. There are so many different ways to go about writing, and there's so many different ways to write. So I say, learn as many rules as you can, but don't be constrained by them. Go ahead, buy some writing manuals, go in there. If anything that helps you write more and write so that you feel like you're doing it, you're in there and you're doing it, that's great. I've had friends who took their first writing class, and they would say, well, this is making me hate myself, or this is making me question everything I've ever thought. If they're still writing, if it's prompting them, if it's challenging them and causing them to write more, then I say, well, go ahead, push your boundaries, keep going with that, see what it does for you to be challenged like that. But if it's shutting you down, if someone is giving you a critique over and over again that is making you stop writing or stop wanting to write, quit. I don't care if you're 2/3 of the way through the class, walk out. Just quit. Don't let anything stop you. I think that's really it. Anything that helps you, anything that feeds your imagination, any structure that is beneficial to you, great, absorb it, use it as needed. But if it's stopping you, if it's making you feel inadequate to the point that you actually don't write, you have to get away from that thing. I've had teachers who were wonderful. They were just brilliant. They knew exactly what to say to prompt a new way of looking at something. And I've had a writer who was a teacher who didn't want to be a teacher. And I admit some of the character in I Wish I Was Like You is taken from this guy. He had a bestseller and he sold the film rights, and then he wrote a lot of other novels, but none of them were ever that successful. And boy, he hated me. He hated everything I wrote. He hated me. He hated my writing. He didn't like my comments in class. So I left. I quit. And the thing was, the damage was already done. Like, I didn't write for about a year and a half after my experience with that guy. So it took me a long time to get back to the place where I felt like, okay, this feels good and I can do this. So I say, if it's destructive, get away from it, run. That's my rule. If it's destructive to your writing and it makes you stop writing, run away.
That's a incredibly helpful reminder that we all need sometimes. Certainly, I've been there in terms of trying to apply something that I learn, like a rule of thumb that simply does not work for me. And yeah. I just finished Knock Knock, and as you're speaking about the writing instinct, I guess, and how important that is, I was stunned by it. I thought that you combined kind of kitchen sink realism with fairy tale conventions to startling effect. Your novel reminded me of Barbara Comyns, a favorite writer of mine. It also brought to mind Lynch's work, notably Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me. And so I'm curious, with your debut novel, what were you reading and or watching while working on it?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I was watching a lot of early 2000s Japanese horror films. I had questions I raised some of the other questions that I had about them in I Wish I Was Like You, which is actually a ghost story. The whole thing is a ghost story. But I was curious. I found these stories fascinating. And I became really obsessed with them. And so I was watching things like Jewell and A Tale of Two Sisters. And, I watched a lot of Japanese and Korean horror films of that period. It's just like the early 2000s. And the thing is, we had just come through a period in American film when I guess everybody just got tired of horror, or they didn't know what to do with it anymore. And so everything was kind of a joke. Everything was meta. Everything was kind of silly. And that's fine. That's fine. I enjoyed Cabin in the Woods. So, it's a lot of fun, which actually came a little later. But I enjoy that. I appreciate it. But I said, these Japanese and Korean films I'm watching, they come from a more serious place. They come from a deeper place. And I wanted to write something that had when I was writing Knock Knock, and that's the book that I started writing when we were visiting Corey's grandmother. So those elements of her life, telling me stories about, I hope those guys don't fire off their guns again tonight. Like, well, why do they fire off their guns? I don't know. They live down the road, they drink some beer, and then they just go outside and fire off their guns. Like, how do you live here? How do you live? And it was reminding me of my own background. My parents grew up in the Deep South, and we used to take poor man vacations, which is we would drive down to the country as often as possible. And so I grew up knowing my aunts and uncles and cousins and people who lived very differently than my parents and myself. But I knew that dark, mysterious, kind of scary atmosphere at night. When you live in the deep country and there are no lights, it's not overtly frightening, but there's something mysterious about it that draws you and at the same time scares you a little bit. And so I started making those connections, between what I saw at Corey's grandmother's house and her stories about living in the country, living in, this little town in Washington, and the things that I experienced as a child in the country where my parents grew up. So there was the mundane element of the day-to-day lives of people who spent, their entire life in this one town. And for me, that had a kind of claustrophobic feeling to it. So I was trying to capture that. I was trying to capture the narrow boundaries, the way that these women navigated and tried to find adventure in their lives. And one of the ways that they found adventure in their lives was by playing games and venturing into an area where they weren't supposed to go. And then I thought, well, what if there is something there that actually isn't safe? What if there is really something there? And what if they ignite this thing and it follows them? And then I was drawing upon those films that I had watched, and I was drawing upon Edgar Allan Poe. Again, serious dark themes. And I was trying to find out if those things could fit together. How does that mysteriousness fit with the mundane aspect of our lives? But basically, what the films gave to me was a sense that we make up these stories for a reason. We rely upon these tales for a reason. It's not just to scare children and tell them to stay out of the woods where they might get hurt. It's because people have experienced odd things they can't really explain. And I'm not someone who is a great believer in the supernatural, but then what do I know? And I also think grief is so powerful, so overwhelming. It takes you, it just grabs you, and you have to just give yourself over to grief. You can't avoid it. You can't make it lighter. You can't make it simpler. You have to go with it. And I wanted to capture something of that, as these films did. I felt like a lot of the films were dealing with a very, very heavy human experience. And I wanted to do that, and I wanted to do it without winking. I wanted to do it without any kind of meta idea overall. I didn't want to lighten it. I wanted what these women suffered and what the people they knew suffered to be real and to be painful and horrible, and to connect with something supernatural that expressed that.
I think that's part of what makes your work stand out is the kind of seriousness with which you handle the material, and that there is not this kind of, I guess, condescending view towards genre that sometimes
Yeah.
we see in the lazier genre fiction. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about this interview you did with the Horror Tree, where you described the influence of Murakami's novel Audition, how you, quote, loved the deceptive simplicity of the style, the
Mhm.
understated depiction of horrific violence, end quote. And you brought this style to The Worst Is Yet to Come and The Best of Both Worlds, saying you wanted, quote, no waste and little repetition. Readers
Yeah.
aren't led by the nose or coddled. They have to accept the brevity of accelerated action, end quote.
Mhm.
So this had me thinking in general, as you were talking about the relationship between content and style. How does content affect your approach to style as a writer?
I think that I was influenced by the writing of the era when I was in college and studying. And overwhelmingly, it was minimalism. And minimalism was a kind of a wave. It was a movement as well, if you consider that Gordon Lish was trying to, teach it and affect a generation of writers. It was a kind of homage to Raymond Carver. Okay. Raymond Carver was fiction god when I was in college. He was it. He was the pinnacle of fiction. Now, there were other people who came just before that who would swear by Ken Kesey. There were people who came along who would swear by Joyce Carol Oates. There were people who came along and they were interested in a different kind of writing. But I would say that when I was there and when I was writing and I was trying to get work published, Raymond Carver really was a powerful influence. Years later, I was fascinated to read about the extent to which Gordon Lish edited Raymond Carver's work because we had all come to appreciate that pared down style. If you can't say it with one sentence, you really don't know what you're doing, kind of thing. It was that attitude. That attitude was around. And I think that I absorbed that to a great extent. I think a lot of my short stories, when I first was sending them out to literary magazines, they were very pared down. And I still draw upon that, but I think I have learned that you can't always get at the thing you want to say that way. You sometimes need the layering. I think in Knock Knock, what I was really trying to do was not say too much, not explain everything to the reader, but to go from one character to another over a long period of time. And by hitting these different points in their lives and talking about them and allowing things to sort of touch upon one another or overlap slightly, I was trying to create a kind of kaleidoscopic effect so that by the time you get to the end of the book, you see a lot of connections that were not spelled out for you as you were going along. Now, I don't know if I achieved that, but that was what I was trying to do. I, again, didn't want to overwrite. I didn't want to explain too much. I still have a preference for writing that allows me to go away and think about the story and come to my own conclusions. I love a story that you could interpret in many different ways. So I guess that's a lot of the time, that's what I'm shooting for. I am shooting for something that doesn't tell you every single thing you need to know about this character. But if you read the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter, and then you see what a different character is doing in a similar situation, then you put things together, things are juxtaposed in a way that the structure of it is the thing that explains things if they need to be explained, rather than the author saying, well, this is why this happens and this is how this happens. And, it's just my personal preference. There are a lot of readers and a lot of writers who really, really love a lot of atmosphere. There are readers and writers who love a lot of explanation of character. And I think that there are places where it's appropriate to go ahead and indulge in, some of the psychology of the character or some of what's going on. But what I really enjoy is when, like in I Wish I Was Like You, what I enjoyed was writing something that was an explanation and then showing you how it wasn't true. Okay, so yes, this is exactly what this is, and here, and you can rely upon this, and then obliterate it. It was just more fun as a writer to look at somebody else's rules. I guess I got the idea for the rules from being online and seeing some writers post their official rules and things that they swear by. And it's totally fine. It's absolutely fine if that's what you swear by. It may or may not work for another writer. It may or may not appeal to all readers. I think the great thing about writing is that it is so open and there are so many possibilities.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. And I mean, I think with Knock Knock in particular, it's interesting you're mentioning, not wanting to undermine the intelligence of the reader and just that fabled relationship between Lish and Carver and the idea of scaffolding and taking things out as much as possible. It was such a delight to read. I mean, there was such a cognitive dissonance for me in experiencing Knock Knock because on the one hand, it is very short and declarative, but that kind of makes any detail extremely rich. I was reading it at a time when I was thinking about, like pregnancy and motherhood, and I'm interested in this concept of evil children. These themes have actually been fixating me lately, so it was exciting to see such an intelligent treatment of them.
It was interesting to me because I had several friends when I was writing the book who had recently gone through giving birth to their first child, or they were going through the process. One thing that I always found so fascinating about it was that it never occurs to people that when you have a baby, it's not anything to fear. It's not anything to, say, oh my God, this could happen, and oh no. But it is often true that people have a baby and they say, this baby is not like me. This baby already has a personality and all these preferences. It's not like the baby's a blank slate and you're training them to like certain things. Baby already has preferences. And so people amaze me when they don't realize that, okay, they maybe have a kind of complicated relationship with one of their parents, right? And they think, well, I'm going to have a baby, and when I have this baby is going to understand me, and we're going to get along great, and I'm going to be such a good mom compared to my mom, or, such a good dad compared to my dad. This is going to be great. And they have the baby, and they go home with their baby, and they find out, I gave birth to my mother. I mean, it's like, they skipped a generation. You can't just start with a blank slate. They're not a blank slate. They have a personality. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have all of the same, difficulties or challenges or whatever that you had with that family member. It doesn't at all. I mean, your relationship with that child is unique. It is special. It is what it is once in the universe, once in a lifetime. But I am always, I don't laugh, but I am amazed at the number of times that people have children and they say, where did this come from? Oh no, wait, it's my dad. Okay. So, learning to look at that and live with that, I thought it was humorous, but I also thought, if this woman really had a terrible relationship with her mother, what if this woman had a terrible relationship with her mother? And she waits and she waits and she puts it off and she doesn't want to have a child and she doesn't. And then she finds out she's pregnant. At this point, she thinks maybe she's going through early menopause, right? She goes to the doctor and finds out, no, it's not early menopause. She is pregnant. And she has that insight, that moment where she goes, I'm going to do this better than my mom did. I can. Not realizing that her life has been affected by a lot of these elements going on around her that she can't control. This is a horror story, so there are supernatural elements to it, and there are things that she can't control. So that starts to be part of her life through her child. And because she never really resolved the trauma with her mother, she never really got the help that she needed to work through that. she immediately starts applying her fears and doubts to her relationship with her baby. So much so that sometimes she doesn't want to walk into the room where her baby is. She hears her baby crawling across the floor, coming toward her, and she's terrified. She becomes afraid of her child because there is something supernatural going on there. It has to do with the town itself. It has to do with this place where she lives and has grown up. But it also has to do with her unresolved fears and anxiety attached to her relationship with her parents. That's what I was reminded of when you were talking. I went off again. I go on and on and on.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about the kind of psychological complexity that you bring to your characters. I think particularly of the book, The Worst Is Yet to Come, which has this very dynamic friendship between two teenage girls who come from very different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. One has what might be seen as an idyllic home life, but if you look beneath the surface, there's a kind of stifling element there. And the other comes from a more dysfunctional, kind of poverty-stricken environment. What is your process for designing these kind of rich, dynamic characters?
I think a lot of those things in that book developed as I went along. And again, I outlined, and then, I'd throw away the outline and start again. A lot of it just continued to develop. I think the very first thing with that book was that there was a contest. You could only write about 1,000 words, I think, 500 or 1,000 words. It was very, very short. And you were supposed to write this kind of flash fiction piece. And then they had a famous author who would judge it. And I don't usually, even back then, I didn't, as a rule, jump into things like that. But in this case, Megan Abbott was the judge. And I thought, wow, okay, well, I'm just going to submit something. And I didn't win. I didn't even get into the finals. But what I wrote became the beginning of The Worst Is Yet to Come. And it started with a girl standing on the front lawn watching her family home burn. And that was the central image, the central idea of that book. So then I took that after the contest was over and everything, and I said, well, I'm still kind of obsessed with this image. I'm still sort of fascinated with who burned it down. Did she have to run? Did she barely escape? Did she set the fire? Did someone else in the family set the fire? Was it natural or supernatural? What happened, right? I was still asking those questions about this scene. And so then I realized that I wanted to build the life of this character around that scene. And just step by step, as I went along, it developed into a story of two families. One family that moved from the city to a less populated place. They thought Scalute, Washington, which is a fictional town, would be a safe, healthy place to raise a child. But if you read between the lines, the parents, once they move to this place, they don't really engage that much with the community. They don't connect very much. Yeah, they settled there for their child, for their daughter, to have a, comfortable and safe and healthy environment, they thought. And I contend that, I don't think there's any place safer than a city because you're just surrounded by people, okay? But that's okay. A lot of people feel like the country is safer and healthier and better. I don't know at what point it occurred to me that there were two girls. Oh, I think it didn't occur to me until I was actually at the point where I was writing the scene of this girl in the locker room at her high school. And she turns around, she looks around, and she thinks she's looking at a mirror, but she's actually looking at another girl. And that intrigued me, and that kind of blossomed into the rest of the story and how things came about. Because we have this one poor family living in a trailer home. They've just come there recently. And we have this family that's moved to Scalute to have a safer, healthier place for their child. And yet, there's something wrong. There's something going on beneath the surface of that very, very dedicated family, very dedicated parents. It's just not quite right. And you don't find out what that's all about until these two girls meet. And one of them supposedly starts getting the other one in trouble. So I think that was one where, I took notes and I made outlines as I went along, but there were a lot of moments that affected the whole story. And then I'd have to go back to the beginning and, work through again with that idea in mind. And that was one of those where this girl turned around in the locker room, saw someone, and said, "Oh, wait a minute, that's not me." So I had to work back, and then work forward again to accommodate that and to build on that. But sometimes, that happens when you're writing. You've got everything planned out and everything makes sense. And then you have just this weird aha moment.
Yeah. And when those moments happen, they're so exhilarating. They can be
Yeah.
rare, but you have to chase them when they arrive,
Yeah. I think so. Even if at first glance they ruin your book or ruin your story, I think that you still have to look at them and see what's there and how it affects the characters and the story. And maybe it really brings things to life. Maybe it doesn't work out, but usually it's nagging at your conscious awareness of the story. It's just like this subconscious thing, back there that's just bugging you, and it has come to the surface. And so then if you explore that, it will lead to something interesting.
As you were just talking too about Skaloot, which is this richly developed fictional Washington town, it kind of reminds me of Faulkner's fictional Mississippi County or some of Stephen King's fictional locales like Derry, Maine, or Castle Rock. It has that kind of magnitude of richness and detail. I was curious to ask you how you approach the process of world building. Do you draw maps? Do you use real world equivalents to help situate yourself in the space?
I did draw maps. When I was writing Knock Knock, I drew maps. I drew maps that told me where people lived in relation to one another, so I would know how long it would take. Like when the husband in part 3, Lydia's husband, is coming home and it's foggy and the car breaks down and he can hear something outside. And I wanted to know how long that journey would take. I needed to know how long he would drive from a friend's house, where he would have to stop driving, and how long that walk would take him. Things like that came up all the time. And so I wanted to know the logistics of stuff. So I did draw a lot of maps. Sometimes I'll sketch out like the trailer park where the girl in The Worst Is Yet to Come lived. I sketched that out because I needed to know where this one woman, who was a neighbor of hers, where she lived in relation to the other girl. And I do. I just will draw something, or I'll draw a map for myself, and then I'll adjust that if I need to, but it helps me to get my bearings. But I also drew a lot from the area where my husband grew up. Skaloot, Washington is actually situated in my mind among those small towns, among these little populated areas. It's not very big, and it's not a place where some tragedy occurred that caused all of this weird stuff to happen. But there is something natural and supernatural that is part of the place. And I try to explore that some more and show you some more of it in the novelette that I wrote for the omnibus edition that's coming out. Scott Gable at Broken Eye Books is publishing the omnibus edition of Knock Knock and the 3 related novellas. And I wrote a novelette to be included with that. The Worst Is Yet to Come and The Best of Both Worlds are published by Journalstone, and they are kind of a set. I feel like they work off of one another. I hope they stand alone and you don't have to buy and read both books. But I feel like they're more, if you like one of them, you will enjoy the other one, and it will give you more background and insight. They kind of connect in interesting ways, I hope. But all of the Knock Knock, Delphine Dodd, which is a prequel, Astoria, which picks up in the middle of Knock Knock and takes a character who leaves Skaloot and follows her on her journey. So what's happening to her is happening while part 3 of the book is going on. And then the last novella that I wrote for it was In the Light. And I've added to that a novelette called Anomaly. And so those books, those 5 books, will all be part of the omnibus from Broken Eye Books later this year. But that particular novelette really kind of delves into some background of Skaloot itself. It's not a burial site. It's not it's a little more, and I know in some ways it's a little simpler than that, but it's also mysterious. I do think about the world of Skilloot. Okay, I do think about what it is and how it allows all these things to happen there. All of the weird happenings in people's lives, all of the strange circumstances. I do think about it a lot, and I try to not contradict things that have occurred in other places. Like there are certain types of things that can happen, and I try to be consistent with those. And then there's another type of thing that can happen, and I try to be consistent with that. I had a color thing going on in some of the books too, where every time you see a certain thing or a certain color, there is a kind of reference to another character. If the colors are black and violet, then there is something connected to Marietta going on. And it may be a bird, it may be a butterfly, it may be a flower, it may be any sort of thing, but it somehow plays back into her story or is connected to Marietta's consciousness. So I played a lot with those things, but I try not to contradict myself. I may have missed something somewhere. I don't know. I haven't seen any glaring ones yet. But yeah, I do think about what it's made of and what can happen in a fictional world within those boundaries.
Consistent story logic and world logic is really important. And I look forward to spending more time in, I mean, I'm a little scared to spend more time in Skilloot because it's it's pretty grim there. But
if they ever name a town in Washington Skilloot, drive around it. Do not take that off ramp to Skilloot.
No, it's quite eerie, and no, I was really excited when Mike recommended you to me. We were not surprised to find in a Horror Tree interview that you claim Shirley Jackson is the single biggest influence on your writing. I can see that in your interest in these complicated female friendships and the social horror of small places. And earlier when you were talking about seriousness, I mean, your work is serious, but there is that kind of dark humor that Jackson is so effective at. We both love Jackson's writing, Mike and I. And so I'm curious, given that she looms large in terms of influence for you, what have you learned from Jackson? What do you admire about her? And are there specific novels or stories that have resonated with you most?
There's a great story that a lot of people reference that is just so mysterious and scary and weird in so many different ways, called The Summer People. I was very affected by that. I, of course, love We've Always Lived in the Castle, and I loved The Haunting of Hill House. But some of the stories that affected me most were not necessarily horror stories and not necessarily well known. Like there's this one that I absolutely love, that because a lot of my work deals with identity, with how we are, what we construct of ourselves and what the world demands of us, and how we are shaped by experience, and as I said, what just comes right out of the womb. I'm fascinated with those things. There is a Shirley Jackson short story, and I'm going to have to email this to you later because I honestly, it's in one of the bigger volumes that I have, and I don't remember the title. But it starts out with this woman, very much like Shirley Jackson. Don't know whether she did something similar to this at one time and then based the story on it, or if it's just, fantasy. But she just gets fed up. She looks at her house, she looks at her kids, she looks at her husband, she's just fed up. And she just goes out to the car, gets in the car, and drives away. And she goes on these little adventures. There's such little adventures, like staying at a bed and breakfast, staying at this little place. Everywhere she goes, she tries to establish herself, or she tries to intimate that she is something other than a middle-aged woman who just left her house and her husband and her kids behind, right? And just got in the car and drove off for an adventure. She is not that. She starts telling people that she's this or she's that, or she tries to do things differently, do things the way she wouldn't do them. And everywhere she goes, people keep saying, Well, they took her to be a housewife with children. And, everybody keeps putting her back into her identity. And I'm just obsessed with that. I thought that was so interesting. Finally, she just gets in the car and drives home. I love that story. I also love a really, really, really short one. I think it's just called The Witch, about a woman who has her son who is very young. He's about 5, and a daughter who's just a baby. It's just a little, not even a toddler yet, I think. And this gentleman gets on the train with them, and he starts talking, and it gets progressively weirder. And this story is only just a few pages long, but it's powerful. And it's just a commuter train. It's not a long trip or anything. So he just gets on there and he starts talking about his life and his past. And it just gets really weird. And it starts affecting the son. And he starts talking about violent things and, something terrible that he's done. And it gets the son really excited, and he thinks that's funny and that's cool. And the woman gets more and more alarmed by the effect that this person is having on her child that she thought she knew. I love that too. I love how just an encounter with somebody you don't know can bring out something in someone that was completely unexpected and alarming. I love The Haunting of Hill House, but the things that I love about it are not necessarily the things that other people talk about when they talk about it. One of the things I really love is how Eleanor tries to reinvent herself. She wants very much to be the person that whatever is in the house is trying to connect with. She wants to be that because it makes her special. It makes her different. And one thing that I just thought was so beautiful was how when she's going to Hill House, when she's on the way and she has taken the family car and, to hell with her sister and her family who, are going to try to get the car back, whatever, she just goes off on, again, like Shirley Jackson described in that other story. She takes the car and she goes off on an adventure. She stops at one point and there's this little girl who has a cup. And she's talking about Jackson describes the stars in the bottom of the cup. And later, when Eleanor is talking to people in the house, in Hill House, she describes this cup as her own. It's like she picks up little bits of things to attach to herself they're not even significant, right? It doesn't matter. But she lies. She lies and lies and lies because there's something else she wants to be. And that is the thing that I think is driving the story. It's not whether or not these things in the house are all true. It's not necessarily what happened to make this house so weird. It's not even necessarily the other people, the other characters. It's Eleanor's relentless desire to shape herself, to tell other people who she is, instead of being defined by her family, her mother, her past. That I find really, really interesting.
Yes, well said. Earlier, you were talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and I was thinking I'd be very curious to hear which Poe stories were your favorites, which ones kind of left the biggest mark on you. Like, for instance, I've always been very fascinated with The Black Cat. It's a story I come back to over and over again.
Yeah.
Something about the way he locks you into these tormented psyches. It's like the psychic landscapes of Poe that intrigue me the most, more than his plots, which are usually pretty threadbare.
Yeah. I must have read the Cask of Amontillado when I was 7 or 8 years old. And I mean, at least half of the vocabulary was beyond me. I was constantly looking things up, right? But I thought, oh my God, oh my God. I mean, what does it take? What kind of insanity or pain does it take for someone to do that to someone else, right? What does it take? Where do you have to be psychologically, emotionally? What is going on with you that something like that is even possible? right? I think the thing about Poe is that there are certain things, he does give you bits of, exposition. He does give you things to hold on to, but you're really just plunged into the psychology of the character. You're just in there. And it's frightening for that reason, I think. To be in the experience and in the mind of a character who is capable of just not just violence, but sick, extraordinary violence. It's not just the violence, it's the cruelty, right? It's not enough to hurt someone or even to kill them. It's the cruelty of it that was shocking to me. And I think that stayed with me. And I was writing stories. I mean, when I was 8 years old, I was writing these little stories. And I wrote one about this 8-year-old girl who killed her family and chopped them up and, burned them in the fireplace, right? And I gave it to my mom and dad to read. And they, to their credit, they thought it was hilarious. They loved it. They said, wow, well, we didn't know you could write. And I have met a lot of young writers over the years, right? And I've talked with them about, the things that they write. And yes, if you're a parent or a teacher, you want to be careful and you want to pay attention and you want to help if someone is having a lot of difficulty and they're expressing it in their writing, and you want to be aware and you want to have that conversation, have that dialogue with them, right? But you don't necessarily want to shut them down. Creative writing is one of the best outlets in the world. It's such a great way to make creative use of all the weird things that happen in life. And I think all too often people are frightened by the things that kids come up with when it's not necessarily something you need to worry about. If everything else is going okay, if they're not expressing anxiety or, they're not, having a really tough time in school, they're not being bullied, they're not, if they're doing okay and they come to you with something really bizarre that they've written, it can be that they have observed something, they have seen something in the world that they can't account for, and they're grappling with it. They're trying to understand how these things happen, not even necessarily why, but how can this be? And I know that, from the moment that I first read Edgar Allan Poe, started reading Edgar Allan Poe, I was constantly thinking, how does somebody do that? Why? But more importantly, how? How did he get there? How does he get there? So sometimes it's not that your child is suffering necessarily. It's sometimes just they're asking questions about the world, and they've come up with a very creative way to express that. And I think, you have to use your own expertise as a parent and your own insights to be able to navigate that. Turning to horror in an early age is not necessarily a sign that there's something wrong. It can be that your child is especially thoughtful or especially sensitive or especially aware. It can be a sign of something positive that's going on with them where they're really trying to understand the universe.
Oh, certainly. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the common denominator among most horror writers that I've met is a sensitivity, often very kind and gentle
Yes.
people who maybe are
Yes.
more aware of what's, they pick up on injustices or cruelty going
Yes.
on around them. It's not coming from within them per se.
Yes.
So I agree with you.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I've found some enormously kind and generous people in the horror community. It's really kind of amazing. I mean, I think that when I was in college and people were trying to get into the Paris Review, there was a kind of competitiveness that was a little different. It really had an edge to it. And it kind of, had elbows, and those elbows wanted to, if you couldn't cut it, you're going to get elbowed out. But I've found such generous and lovely people in horror, just really, really kind and helpful and supportive of one another. Not 100%, not universally, but overwhelmingly. Yeah.
Yes, there are always those rare exceptions, but I would agree in general. Yeah, and I think Miriam's tapping into something that there is, I think, often an acute sensitivity underlying that impulse to
Yes.
explore darkness through writing. It's
Yes.
kind of yeah, I think that there's something very true about that. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think so too. If you could sum up the thing that has drawn you to horror, and I'm sure it's not the only area, the only genre that you work in, but what do you think that is? I mean, we talked about the sensitivity of people trying to find out why horrible things happen in the world. How can this be? But what do you think it is for you?
That's a great question. In my case, it's hard to say like chicken or the egg, but it's a combination of some childhood trauma, but also being drawn to. I was really interested in mythology and fairy tale as a child, and my
Hmm.
parents were totally okay to give me the kind of uncensored stuff. I was obsessed with this famous book, Dolaire's Greek Myths. It's been around for a long time.
Hmm.
I think it is from the 50s, and the illustrations were quite like the stories were very vibrant and violent. And it was
Hmm.
the same with the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. They had like the kind of anthology that was for a general audience, not for children specifically. And, things like Bluebeard. I was always obsessed with Bluebeard and with even, I think, in some versions of Cinderella. I could be mistaken, but the stepsisters like cut off their heels to fit into the
Uh,
slipper.
hmm.
So just that kind of stuff just excited. I just really liked violence, I guess, and it could have been because I had like many people, some childhood trauma, some gothic stuff, familial trauma in my family, and maybe it was a way to identify that or kind of cathartic to see that in the world and to feel that I was not alone. That's my answer.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think some of those things that you're describing about fairy tales, sometimes it is the vividness of it that attracts us at an early age. It's just so powerful compared to what we're reading otherwise.
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
And even some more recent classics like Robert Munch, for example, those were pretty dark sometimes, those books. And yeah, it's just a little more high octane for the child brain than some kind of insipid, I don't know. I mean, most of the stuff I'm thinking of is pretty thrilling. Like Dr. Seuss is even kind of freaky. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think my very first book that I ever actually read all the way, was like a book was a book called Go Dog Go. And it was just these dogs just running around doing amazing things, going to parties and having parties in the tops of trees and things. And they were all driving these crazy cars and stuff. And I must have read that book 100 times. I just thought because it hits you in that way. It's vivid and it's strong and yeah, yeah.
Oh, certainly. How about you, Mike? What do you think makes you so interested in horror?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you touched on some of the main things. I think I was always, to some degree, it wasn't only that I was anxious, it was also that I just had a very active imagination. And I
Yeah,
think horror is probably the ultimate endpoint for imaginative writing, especially when it goes into
right.
the more numinous, fantastical territory. I always loved fantasy fiction as well. So horror became almost an exciting way to rehearse anxiety and fear for me, I
Yeah,
think. So
yeah, that makes sense.
it's an interesting question because in some ways, it's something we just take for granted, right? It's like our taste in food almost. It's just like this kind of predilection that's so hard to qualify in some ways, you know?
Yeah, the things that people bring up about their connection to it. Yeah.
And some of it is very difficult to verbalize, just like I would like the feeling of going down into the basement when the lights weren't on. I liked the idea of not knowing what was around the corner. Why was it
Hmm.
that I liked that feeling? I don't know.
Hmm.
It's like some atavistic thing. Other
Yeah.
kids would probably hate that feeling, but I
Yeah.
loved it.
I remember there was a moment in my childhood when I had a couple of friends who were afraid of the dark, right? And I was never afraid of the dark. I was afraid of my mom coming around the corner and going, ah, just nutty, just, ah. And that would scare the hell out of me. But I wasn't afraid of the dark. And I think there was a moment when it occurred to me. Most, if it's alive, it has sight, and it can't see me either. Okay, so I just like was like, oh, because I didn't, I just thought, oh, I'm weird to someone else. I'm weird to something else, right? I'm
Right.
probably scary to something else. And that was, so I didn't have that particular fear. I have other anxieties, but other phobias, but not afraid of the dark.
That's fascinating. And it speaks to the empathy thing too, thinking, what would what would some other uh how
Some
would
other
this creature
creature.
feel?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. If I scared the hell out of them. Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's good. Have you read anything recently that has particularly excited you?
Recently, I have been reading quite a lot of crime fiction and thrillers, suspense thrillers. I'm not interested in, spies or, is the world going to end or can I save it kind of thing, or that particular kind of so much. Although that's great, that's great. But I'm drawn to, again, these intimate personal relationships and how people can, twist them and do terrible things to one another. As I said before, I've read a lot of Megan Abbott, and for some reason, I'm always interested in women who write this kind of fiction and write strong, interesting, complicated female protagonists. So I've been reading books by Lisa Jewell and Alice Feeney, and I'm still just, dabbling. But the novel that I just wrote that's going to come out in September is called If You Knew Me, and it is about a young writer. She's in her 20s. She thought that her life was going to take a certain course because she had laid the groundwork to be a writer. And she was working for her aunt, who has this renowned website in Seattle. And they get through COVID, they get through lockdown. It's looking like her career will take off. And her aunt decides to shut down the website. So she has no platform anymore. She has no place where her career can build. And she's suddenly turned into just another freelance writer out there searching. Her aunt gives her a job going through the old files, the ones that are print. They've already looked at and stored or disposed the digital editions. But when she's going through this, she finds this pitch that has been sitting around for ages. It's been sitting around for a couple of years. And it is basically a pitch by this woman who lives in Arizona who describes something terrible that she did when she was a child, when she was in middle school. And it causes the writer to stop and say, well, she's just immediately gripped by this and wants to write this woman's story. And she's looking at people like Tanya Had, who pretended to be a 9/11 survivor. She's looking at the guy who pretended to be a kidnapped child who came back to the family and they accepted him. She's looking at the young woman who pretended to be an heiress who fooled a bunch of people in New York and got a bunch of funding for a huge project. And then it turned out she wasn't any of the things she said she was. She's interested in these people because she's thinking probably this woman is exaggerating or she's kind of twisted the story. So she goes to find out. She's thinking, well, I can make a name for myself off of this story. I mean, the heiress who cheated everybody, that turned out to be a big story in a big magazine. And then a Netflix documentary, and, it's going to be, a movie. So she thinks she can base something on this. And she does not realize what she's getting into. What she's getting into is much worse than she ever imagined. So those are the not supernatural, but very frightening possible consequences of connecting with people. I think that is sort of obsessing me right now. So I've been reading that kind of book while I was working on this novel. I mean, I always read that kind of book along with supernatural horror and not supernatural horror, but I have been doing it more of a conscious, how do you get there? How do you do this? Where do you go with this? How far can you go with this? If there's no supernatural element, how can you build this into your story? That kind of thing.
I can't wait to read that. But I'm also very interested in kind of women who, I guess, bad women, some people say, or even this kind of con women. Do you have any particular titles to recommend? Because I'd be very curious to check some of these out.
Yeah. One of the Lisa Jewell books that I liked a lot was called None of This Is True. That one was about two women who just absolutely purely by chance happened to meet and find that they have the exact same birth date. And then one of them says, "Oh, well, that's something. Let's talk." And the other one has a podcast. She doesn't really want to get involved with the other woman, but the woman keeps pushing it. Oh, there must be something to this. If we have the same birth date, there must be some connection between us. We must have some special understanding or something. And so she, just keeps on doing that, keeps on pushing. I am now looking at my Kindle. Oh, I just finished reading Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney, which has wicked twists to it. Just wicked. I mean, I'm hard to surprise, okay? I can get to the absolute climax of a story and go, yeah, I knew it was going to be that when I started. On page 40, I knew it was going to be, and I pride myself in being able to figure out something before it happens. But I did not see that coming. Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. Crazy. Yeah, and like I said, anything by Megan Abbott, because I've read almost all of her books. So much good stuff. She writes the most fascinating, complicated women. And I always pick up the Best American Mystery and Suspense of the year. This year it was edited by S.A. Cosby. So it's very, very good. So that's the 2024 edition. But I remember the 2023 was just exceptional. I also read a book by A.R. Torre called The Last Party. But that one is a little more high concept, and it's a little more, I think that she writes a lot of romance novels. And so this was not a romance novel. It was more in the vein of what we've been talking about. But the reason that I stuck with this and enjoyed it so much is because it's one of those stories where someone's married to someone and they begin to find out that they don't know anything about the person they're married to. I'm kind of a sucker for stories where someone you're really, really close to turns out to have something in their past that you knew nothing about that causes everything to go in another direction. And that's what I was enjoying doing with my novel, kind of layering together the story of someone who's very ambitious and the story of someone who is more of an unknown. One is an unknown writer, and the other one is a complete mystery, and perhaps a terrifying one. Perhaps what's behind it and behind her and her past. Anyway, unraveling those things. I enjoy that. Yeah, I would say that those are very much the ones that I got most excited about recently.
I'm very excited for that next novel. And also, we're definitely going to pick up the Skaloot Omnibus. And I want to encourage our listeners to definitely do not sleep on S.P. Miskowski, one of my favorite living writers. I'm always excited to see what you have coming out next. So it's such a pleasure and an honor getting to talk with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for choosing me. It's such a good idea and such a good series. And I wish you the best. I think this is a great idea. More writer talk and craft talk especially is always interesting. And thanks. It's just been great talking with you.
The pleasure is all ours, SP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.